I want to start by thanking Erpik for inviting me, as other speakers have done. I'm delighted to be here. It's not the first time I've been to Cyprus or even to Nicosia. My first visit to Nicosia was in 1970, when I was a young adolescent with my family. It's a joy to be back. Thank you. I think this session links quite nicely with previous sessions today. The video presentation, which many of us have just seen by the ambassador, dealing with conflicting territorial claims, particularly maritime claims. The session by Gary before lunch, similar matters, similar issues. And in the ambassador's session earlier today, this morning, where he in his paper refers to the alleged violation of Turkish airspace by Israeli military aircraft in 2007 following the attack on Syria. Those are all useful antecedents for this particular session. I just wanted to make a comment about the reference in the ambassador's paper to the violation, or the alleged violation, of Turkish airspace by Israeli aircraft. Violation of a state's sovereign airspace is certainly enough to warrant a protest by the one government to the other, and even to the United Nations. Violation after an attack on a military installation in another country is all the more to be expected, because under the international law of state responsibility, the view could well have been taken, or might have been taken, that Turkey, by allowing Israeli military aircraft to fly through Turkish airspace, if that had been the view, Turkey had somehow assisted Israel in what some might have construed as an illegal attack on that installation in Syria. So you can see how what might appear to be a fairly innocent or mundane entry into a state's territorial airspace could in fact be many more serious matters. In the same context, the French government closed French airspace to US military aircraft in 1986, April or May I think it was, in 1986, preventing those military aircraft from using French airspace on their way to bomb Tripoli in Libya. Conversely, the then British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, allowed the very same bombers, US bombers, to take off from RAF air bases in England. But it's another example of how state responsibility issues can arise in this context. As you'll see from that first slide, sovereignty is everything. Sovereignty is the key to much of air law, as it has been said. The Chicago Convention of 1944, which is the principal air law convention, and it's almost universally ratified. I forget the precise number of states, but it's about 180 or 190. Almost every state in the world has ratified or acceded to it. And the very first article of the Chicago Convention proclaims that every state has complete and exclusive sovereignty over the airspace of other states. And the Chicago Convention wasn't saying anything new here. It was indeed proclaiming an already recognized rule of international law. In the second article, as you can see, the Convention tells us what it means by territory, the territory of the state. And it includes not only the land territory of a state, but also its territorial waters. So we can say from these first two articles of the Chicago Convention that every single state, whether landlocked or coastal, has complete and exclusive sovereignty over the airspace above its territory. And if it's a coastal state, that includes the airspace above its territorial sea. Begs the question, well, how far up does this sovereignty extend? And that's not a question that I'm going to deal with in the presentation, although we can certainly discuss it afterwards. Basically, the upper limit of national sovereignty has not yet been defined or agreed upon. Various theories have been put forward. To the best of my knowledge, we don't yet have agreement. It doesn't really matter, because the lowest altitude, if you like, at which a man-made satellite can remain in orbit is is so far above the normal operating altitude of most aircraft that it really doesn't matter for practical purposes. The corollary of this principle of sovereignty is that the airspace above international areas is, like the subjacent area, an international space, not subject to the sovereignty of any state. And this is particularly true of the airspace over the high seas. The high seas themselves are an international area, an international space, not subject to the sovereignty of any state, and the same is true of the airspace above the high seas, because the general principle is that airspace derives its legal status from the subjacent territory, from the subjacent land or sea. And because the airspace of the high seas is an international space, the legal regime that applies there is characterized by the principle of freedom. We talk about the freedom of the high seas. And one element of the freedom of the high seas is the freedom of overflight above the high seas. And this is proclaimed in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which we were learning more about in the video at lunch. But that freedom of the high seas and the freedom of overflight, which is one of its elements, is not absolute. It can't be. Because this is a freedom that every single state in the world, every single state member of the international community enjoys. Therefore, it has to be regulated in the interests of all who are entitled to enjoy it. And this is where I begin to get a little closer to answering some of the questions you were alluding to, Ray, in your introduction. How is it regulated? Who controls it? It follows from what we've seen so far that the issues of delimitation, how far out does sovereignty extend, how far up does it extend, and the issue of regime, what are the legal rules and principles that apply in a given area, those issues of delimitation and regime are inextricably linked. And it follows from that that if you've got a territorial dispute between two or more countries, that dispute, or those disputes, can, and sometimes do, endanger civil aviation, or all aviation, but civil aviation in particular, as we'll see. And I think a good illustration of this is the Aegean Sea airspace dispute between Greece and Turkey, which I refer to on page 2 of my paper. I won't go into all the details, but my understanding is that essentially, and Klearchos will correct me if I'm wrong here, Turkey insists that Greek airspace over the Aegean extends only 10 kilometres offshore. Greece claims that it extends 16 kilometres offshore. You have a dispute, a territorial dispute between the two countries. And as a direct result of that dispute, in May 2006, as you can see, Greek and Turkish F-16 fighters collided at about 27,000 feet over the southern Aegean. Greece said that its planes had intercepted Turkish aircraft in Greek airspace. Turkey claimed that the Greek aircraft had interfered with Turkish military aircraft on manoeuvres in international airspace. Will be on one of several parallel tracks, usually 5 or 6 going westbound and 5 or 6 coming the other way. And the tracks are established by computer, at least I think twice a day, taking into account winds and other weather conditions. So the tracks are not fixed from day to day, or they're not the same tracks every day. They change. They're changing according to weather and other conditions. So when you're flying over the North Atlantic, although you're well outside the normal distance for radio coverage and radar coverage, more particularly, you are still being controlled. Your aircraft is being controlled. Up to 30 degrees west by Shanwick, beyond 30 degrees west, going west by Gander or New York.
What's liable for negligence?
For negligence?
In those areas?
in those areas? Well, I suppose it depends on whose negligence we're talking about.
I'm talking about aircraft from Argentina to Paris.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what caused the accident? That's what I'd want to know.
Well, I'm asking myself why a rescue team class action suit.
Yeah.
I'm asking myself,
That's
in
a
the
good question.
conflict of nation states
Yes.
between Turkey and Greece, an
Yes.
example of such an incident occurring, where's the liability?
Sure. I mean, in the Air France crash, I'm dredging this up from memory because I haven't looked at this recently, but I think some of the wreckage was found, or wasn't it the last point of contact? You're right, it was. Yeah. Who's negligent? I think I would want...
Who has liability?
Who has liability? Well, it could be the aircraft manufacturer.
Yeah.
If it's down to a defect of the plane.
Like air traffic control.
Oh, okay.
Has that been already regulated by conventions in other protocols following?
I don't think it's been regulated by convention or treaty, but I stand to be corrected on that because I'm not absolutely sure. But it's a good point, very good point. Still over the high seas now. This is what Article 12 of the Chicago Convention says. That every contracting state, every state party to the Chicago Convention, undertakes to adopt measures to ensure that every aircraft bearing its nationality mark, wherever that aircraft may be, shall comply with the rules of the air there in force. So whatever rules are applicable in a particular area of airspace, it's the state of which the aircraft is a national, because aircraft have nationality just like you and I have nationality, and ships. It's that state, the state of registration, that has undertaken to ensure that its aircraft bearing its nationality mark comply with the rules of the air there in force. The question arises, well, which are the rules in force, which are the rules applicable over the high seas, the international area, subject to no state sovereignty? The Convention says, second bullet, over the high seas, the rules in force shall be those established under the Convention, the Chicago Convention. And what that means is that over the high seas, over any areas of high seas, anywhere in the world, compliance with the ICAO's own rules of the air that we find mainly in Annex 2 to the Convention is mandatory. Every aircraft, every civil aircraft that is, must comply with ICAO's rules of the air when flying over international waters, over the high seas. That's the effect of Article 12 of the Chicago Convention, and it reflects that special legal regime of the airspaces of the high seas. Now, one of those rules, one of many rules in Annex 2, is the one at the bottom. And I've singled this out because it's particularly relevant when we deal with aerial incidents in a few moments' time. It requires a flight plan to be submitted to the appropriate air traffic services unit prior to operating any flight across international borders. Now that does not mean any flight across territorial borders, it means any flight across an FIR boundary, a flight information region boundary. So for the purposes of that particular rule of the air, you're crossing an international border when you cross from one FIR into another. You may not overfly a particular state. You may be in international airspace, but if you're crossing an FIR boundary, if you're going to cross an FIR boundary, you have to file a flight plan with the appropriate air traffic control unit. And this is what lies behind a number of the violations or alleged violations of airspace that we will deal with in a few moments' time. Why is all this relevant when we deal with aerial incidents? Because the Chicago Convention and ICAO's rules of the air that have been adopted under the Convention, that we find mainly in Annex 2, only apply to civil aircraft. They don't apply to state aircraft. And as you can see from the second bullet, Article 3B of the Chicago Convention says that aircraft that are used in military, customs and police services are deemed to be state aircraft. It's a functional criterion. If an aircraft is used in military services, or a military service, or for military purposes, it's deemed to be a state aircraft. And military aircraft, therefore, do not have to comply with the convention or with the rules of the air adopted under the convention. However, in Article 3D of the convention, we read what we find in the third bullet. The contracting states have undertaken, when issuing regulations for their state aircraft, including their military aircraft, that they will have due regard for the safety of navigation of civil aircraft. So the Chicago Convention says, on the one hand, military aircraft do not have to comply with the rules of the air in Annex 2, which for civil airliners are compulsory over the high seas. But contracting states to the convention do, when issuing regulations for their military and other state aircraft, have to undertake that they will have due regard for the safety of navigation of civil aviation. More often than not, that is complied with. The obligation in 3D is complied with, but not always, as we shall see. And that will be particularly relevant when we consider in a few moments' time aerial incidents over the Eastern Mediterranean in the Nicosia FIR. So let's turn to the Nicosia FIR. And I deal with this on pages 5 and following of the paper. The heading there is Airspace Sovereignty and Air Traffic Control Procedures in the Nicosia FIR. I've got a chart, an ICAO chart that I'll put up on the screen in a moment, just to give you a visual impression of the extent of the Nicosia FIR. But first of all, let's understand what it is in words. It's the airspace over the land and sea territory of the Republic of Cyprus, including the territorial sea, plus the international airspace over the Eastern Mediterranean, in respect of which ICAO has assigned responsibility to the Republic of Cyprus. And as you'll see in a moment, it's a vast area of airspace. This chart does not show up well at all, I'm afraid, particularly with the lights on. But no matter, because what I really want to show is simply the extent of the Nicosia FIR. And the boundary of the Nicosia FIR is that solid line that you can see, like a piece of a jigsaw. The Republic of Cyprus, I think, is somewhere around there. I can't see it myself, especially now, because the lights have just gone on. But if we were able to see this more clearly, you'd see that the northern boundary of the Nicosia FIR runs very, very close indeed to the Turkish coast. It's probably, I need to look at this and be more precise, it's probably no more than about 80 miles off the Turkish coast. So it's a vast area of airspace. And the point is this, that
could it actually be going within Turkish territorial waters? Because
no, it doesn't, as far as I know, it doesn't cross over into Turkish airspace.
Okay.
The extent of Turkish airspace...
But it probably goes up to there. Because it's only 30 miles, the whole distance at some places.
That's right, that's right.
It's like...
You mentioned here that this is a colonial airspace.
It's inherited.
Yes, it's inherited.
That's right, that's
it
right.
pushes a lot the Turkish
Yes.
limit up to the coastline. I don't think it violates territorial waters.
No, I think that's
and
right.
it also pushed to the limits the Lebanese airspace
Yeah.
and the Israeli airspace.
Yes.
And as a result, ages ago, well, maybe 20 years ago, some years ago, when the technology was not as advanced as it is now, in order to take off from Beirut airport and Tel Aviv, there was a need to have some sort of coordination because when you take off within minimal time, you would enter the area controlled. It's not airspace, it's FIR,
Yes.
which is controlled area but not sovereign airspace of Cyprus. So the last thing Tel Aviv and Beirut and of course Nicosia FIR wanted is messy situations involving potential accident.
That's
And
right.
to the your previous comment, because I was flying extensively during the time of the Lebanon crisis, there were American aircraft carriers and French, the Foch and Clemenceau, if I remember, an American aircraft carrier constellation. They were coordinating with, although they are not supposed to, they were coordinating with FIR, Nicosia, so as not to have any accident, with smaller aircraft flying at a lower altitude. And I remember, and I remember a colleague of mine at that time, he was a trainee, he tried to do a very open turn to go into Larnaca, and he approached very, very closely the USS aircraft carrier constellation. So it was one of the very few propeller Cypriot aircraft to be intercepted by F-14 Tomcats.
That's a lovely story.
Yeah, that colleague, I think.
Former colleague.
Yeah.
Well, no, alive, but I think he got his lesson very well.
You mentioned aerial interception. There is a footnote in the paper, I can't remember exactly which one it is, that deals with aerial interception. In readiness for this conference, and because I'm interested in the subject anyway, I purchased this current en route navigation chart for the Eastern Med. And you can have a look at it afterwards if you'd like. And when you look at it up close and personal, you see just how close the northern boundary of the FIR is to Turkey. I mean, it's much less than 80 miles in certain places, I would say. Yeah, sure, by all means. It's that big.
It's less than 40 miles.
Should be less than 8 miles, not 80.
Yeah, the reason I said 80, which was a generalization, I'll explain in a moment or two, but I think in certain places it's much less than that. Much less than that. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Now this is what the Treaty of Establishment says about airspace sovereignty in the Nicosia FIR. Article 1 of the treaty says the territory of the Republic shall comprise the island of Cyprus, together with the islands lying off its coast, with the exception of the sovereign base areas, the two sovereign base areas, which areas shall remain under the sovereignty of the UK. And that position is basically confirmed in Section 2 of the UK Cyprus Act of 1960. So what it appears we've got, and I put a question mark because I want to check this out a little bit more thoroughly. What it appears we've got is areas of UK sovereign airspace within the Nicosia FIR. That's what it appears we've got. And if that's true, it's similar to the situation we have over the Channel Islands. The Channel Islands are crown dependencies, but they're situated in the Brest FIR, and the Brest FIR is one of France's regional flight information regions. So if I go back to the Eurocontrol chart, we should be able to see, if I can use this pointer, that you see there is the boundary between the UK FIR and the France, the Brest FIR. There's the Cherbourg Peninsula, and of course the Channel Islands are, I've lost my red pointer. Oh, there it is. The Channel Islands are there. They're south of the FIR boundary. They're in the Brest FIR area, but they are nonetheless crown dependencies, subject to the sovereignty of the British Crown. So a similar situation, I suggest, to the sovereign base areas, but not the same, because the legal status of the sovereign base areas is different.
A small peculiarity, in addition to the two British bases, we have on the mountain photos,
Yeah.
Complicated situation.
So you've got military and civilian, and tensions sometimes, presumably?
Oh, no.
No? Working quite harmoniously together.
Well, they don't love each other, but they work.
It's not a love affair.
Love is not in the air, but they work quite efficiently.
There's a recent decision of the English Administrative Court. This is a bit small, I apologise, but you'll find me referring to this on pages 6 and 7 of the paper, if it's easier to follow. This is a judgment of the Administrative Court in London on the 28th of July this year. And it's particularly relevant to our conference and to our topic, this topic, because it was an application for judicial review, AJR, of the Secretary of State for Transport's decision to refuse what we can broadly call operating permit applications by a Turkish airline and a travel agent, a travel company. And basically, the purpose of the application, the purpose of the operating permit applications was to allow the airline, the two claimants basically, to operate directly, to pick up passengers in northern Cyprus and fly them to England and take people from England to northern Cyprus. Something that is not lawful at the moment under the existing operating permits. So the claimants, the Turkish claimants, wanted the High Court to grant a variation of one particular permit and to approve the adoption of an additional permit that would allow what they were asking for. What interested me when I read this judgment a couple of weeks ago was that the judge, I've forgotten his name, but it's in the paper.
Mr. Justice Williams.
Wynne Williams, that's right, Mr. Justice Wynne Williams. He declared, as you can see in the second bullet, that the Republic of Cyprus has exclusive sovereignty over the airspace above the whole of the island of Cyprus and territorial waters adjacent thereto. Now, I think, but I stand to be corrected, well, that's too sweeping. I think he's got it wrong. And what's curious is that earlier in the judgment, before he makes this statement, he recognises that the Treaty of Establishment, and particularly the UK Act, the Cyprus Act, excludes from the sovereignty of the Republic the sovereign base areas. But there's no mention of the sovereign base areas in that rather general, sweeping, broad declaration about sovereignty. So there's this 10-minute rule that the Republic's authorities have introduced, and which is respected more often than not by, as far as I know, all civil aviation. The accuracy of that blog entry is confirmed by the bulletin that's mentioned in the third bullet point, this Jefferson briefing bulletin. Jefferson is an American company that produces aeronautical charts and briefing bulletins for pilots and other things. And this is a bulletin on communications and control procedures in the Nicosia FIR. And you can see the bulletin entry on pages 10 and 11, and essentially it confirms the accuracy of that blog entry and the 10-minute requirement. Whether you're flying south from Nicosia FIR into Ankara, or flying north from Nicosia into Ankara, or coming south from Ankara into Nicosia.
So that would apply to the Turkish Airlines flights?
Yes.
Coming into Timbuktu?
The problem is,
they tell us?
The problem is it's not always complied with by every airline. And sometimes, and I think it will depend on the particular airline, particular pilot, I need to do more work on.
So it's policy on the airline.
It's policy on the airline. So
Russians prohibit their pilots from taking to Ercan. British Airways pilots do too.
Sorry, say that again. Russians?
Russian civil aviation prohibits Russian pilots to talk to Ercan.
To talk to Ercan. Ah, okay. In northern Cyprus.
Northern Cyprus.
Yes.
Or Timbuktu.
Yes.
British civil aviation encourages, and it's not a British conspiracy once more, it is for reasons of communication and exchange of information. You are better off if you exchange information than if you do not.
Yes.
But I assume the Turkish Airlines don't talk.
They do talk to Nicosia. Every Turkish airline that flies from Ankara to Egypt or to Sudan or whatever.
Coming into Timbuktu?
No. They fly, they talk to Timbuktu, and then they call. It's 121.5 if I remember the frequency. talk about whatever, Nicosia FIR, permission to overfly on our way to Alexandria.
They're going to land in Timbuk.
No, they don't.
So my Austrian Airlines flight, which comes in,
Yes.
could bump into a Turkish Airlines flight.
There is a risk of conflict, absolutely.
Yeah, but there is a gentleman agreement. There is a gentleman's agreement that Turkey sends all the traffic using a narrow corridor, which is this one, north-south.
Okay.
The gentleman agreement is that Cyprus brings in from the side over Pyrgos, Tillirias, Tilliria, the north Paphos, and from Agia Napa, Protaras, so as to minimize the risk. But
So
if you ask me, if I'm scared every time I fly for reasons of messing up,
You are. I got that impression.
and my first pilot license was 1981. So if I'm so many years flying and I'm still scared of the language of collision, yes, things are serious.
That's very helpful indeed, thank you, because that was my assumption from the little work that I've done on this already.
Could I just say that I'm guilty?
Are we running out of time?
We are running out of time.
Okay. Let me conclude. I just want to very briefly show you some examples of the kinds of incidents we've had in the Nicosia FIR. There's an example of good practice, as long as it's followed. 27th of February 2003, shortly before the Iraq invasion, US Embassy Nicosia issues a press release. All US military flights operating in international airspace in the Nicosia FIR follow or exceed applicable international procedures. But we've got a catalogue of incidents, and one such is documented for you on page 14, the top half. This is the letter of the 25th of June 2005, when the government of the Republic of Cyprus complained to the UN Secretary General about violations of Nicosia's FIR by Turkish military aircraft, not just of the FIR boundary, but of the Republic's own territorial airspace, which, as we said earlier, is even more serious. I don't know whether these violations actually happened or whether we must call them alleged violations. I don't know the facts. I'm simply giving you the example of the letter. And then lastly, we've got a similar situation, also on page 14, but involving Israeli military aircraft. May 2000, Israel apologized to Cyprus for repeated violations of the FIR. The government had complained that on over 100 occasions, Israeli military aircraft had entered the FIR without first submitting flight plans. Remember that rule, that you have to submit a flight plan when flying over an FIR boundary. Israeli military aircraft hadn't done it. The government of Israel is reported to have apologized. I better leave it there. Thank you very much for those questions. Excellent.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. That was very interesting. You didn't assuage my mind exactly what Nick said. I'm sure you'd be willing to take personal questions at the end if people have still got their fears bothering them. But
A Greek pilot was killed. This wasn't simply words or hot air. A death ensued. And not the first death by any means. There have been scores of deaths as a result of this particular territorial dispute in the airspace over the Aegean. As you can see, an Olympic Airways pilot was quoted as saying, "We obey the rules of the sky, but the fighter pilots don't." I think he was speaking on behalf of all civilian air pilots. And a Greek investigator, air investigator, observed, there is very limited space over the Aegean. Its air corridors are very crowded. It's only a matter of time before a warplane crashes into a commercial plane. I'm sorry to mention that, Ray, because it probably doesn't do anything to allay your fears, contrary to what I promised at the start. But it's a reality of the current geopolitical situation.
Can I just interject there?
Sure. Yes, of course. Please do.
A small incident, a relatively small incident such as that, can have profound geopolitical, worldwide reverberations. What occurred on 9/11 is a prime example of that. Catastrophic though it was, it resulted in a worldwide event, and this is, I think, the importance of the point that Nick has just made.
That's a very good point, and I'd like to take my cue from you, Kyriakos, and say to everybody, don't stand on ceremony, don't wait necessarily for a question and answer session, but if you feel that you want to say something or to question, please do jump in. It'll help to make this graveyard slot after lunch a more bearable one. Yeah?
About the height of the airspace.
Yes.
There's one theory that it extends up to, everyone, there's an actual theory which is applicable, but some people say it goes up to the maximum height that commercial jetliners
Yes.
use, which is 45,000.
That's right.
Or I think roughly 12 kilometers.
Yes.
Some others say that it's the maximum height of military aircraft, which should be 1,000 feet or 30 kilometers.
Yes.
And just to lighten up the conversation over lunch, etc., I remember 25 years ago, Indonesia pioneered in legal science in claiming that because geosynchronous
Yes.
satellites,
Yes.
these are the satellites that move in synchronizing with the Earth,
Yes.
and they are at a standard height of 36,000 kilometers. Indonesia claimed that these satellites were overflying Indonesian airspace, and as a result, he wanted some money out of it, bakshish, as they say in Arabic, or pocket money, however you want to call it.
That's right. Indonesia did indeed. In fact, many of the equatorial states, I think, made the same or similar claims.
Yeah, for 36,000
That's right.
kilometers.
That's
which
right.
is, I mean, a distance from here to America 6 times or something like that.
Yes.
Is there a rule of thumb what is actually that's applicable?
I think I'm a bit rusty on this, to be perfectly honest. But the Soviet Union in the 80s, or the late 80s, I think, suggested the boundary at something like 110 kilometres. I don't think kilometres. I don't think that
So
was
that's low.
effort to try and think it. Doesn't help us very much to understand what an FIR is. But basically, as you can see from the second bullet, if we're talking about a coastal state, like the Republic of Cyprus, its FIR consists, first of all, of the airspace above its own land and sea territory, but also any international airspace in respect of which the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, has assigned responsibility, control responsibility, to Cyprus. All, or certainly most coastal states in the world are given by ICAO responsibility for controlling air traffic over areas of international airspace adjacent to their own land and sea territory. In the a chart that, if I can work this technology, will help us to see what I mean here. This is a chart produced by Eurocontrol, which is responsible, among other things, for air traffic control in much of Europe. And the chart is showing flight information regions and upper flight information regions, UIRs, in the Eurocontrol region. Now, it's not a very clear chart, I have to admit, but I've got a pointer which will help us to make out certain parts of it. Each one of those blocks looks a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. Each one of those areas is a flight information region. You can see how many there are across the whole of the Eurocontrol area. There are the British Isles, there's the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. And you can see how extensive the UK FIR is. And you can see that it obviously includes not just the land territory of the UK, not just even the territorial sea airspace of the UK, but vast areas of international airspace adjacent to the British Isles. Over here we have Cyprus. Where are we? Excuse me. There. This is the Nicosia FIR. This is a portion here. There's Ankara. This is Damascus. There's Beirut. There's Tel Aviv. There's Cairo. And so on and so forth. There's Athens here. So a patchwork, a network of flight information regions.
Does Athens go into Turkey then?
It doesn't go into Turkey, but this is one reason why we have the Aegean Sea airspace dispute. Because as I'll show,
Through Turkey.
I'm sorry, goes right up through Turkey.
The line goes into the Aegean, right?
I can't see it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The Athens FIR stops there. It doesn't actually go beyond the sea boundary of Turkey, as I understand it. But for reasons that I'll explain in more detail in a moment, I think we'll understand why we have these aerial incidents from time to time in the Aegean and even closer to home.
So I think Mr. Collins is right. There is a point in opposite roads, northeast of Rhodes, where the Greek FIR goes into Turkey.
Is there?
And as a result, Cyprus Airways flights, aircraft, are overflying the peninsula of Turkey,
Right.
which, weirdly enough, was assigned in the Greek FIR.
Yep. There's roads there.
Yeah, somewhere there is a peninsula.
And you see here is the Turkish, the Ankara FIR boundary.
But there's one peninsula that is
There is
100% Turkish.
That's interesting.
Sovereign space,
Thank-
but it's Greek FIR.
Thank you for that. I need to look at that. Thank you very much. Just before we move on from this slide, you see this area here, to the west of the British Isles. This is part of what's called the Oceanic Control Area, above the eastern half of the North Atlantic. And that Oceanic Control Area is controlled, flights in it are controlled by a combination of Shannon and Prestwick. Shannon in the Republic of Ireland, Prestwick in Scotland, from which we get Shanwick, Shannon, Prestwick. And essentially you've got controllers looking at radar screens in one of those places and conversations going on, I think, via telecommunications links in the other. It's a combination of Shannon and Prestwick. And the other side of the North Atlantic, you have similar, you have another oceanic control area that is controlled by, among others, Gander and New York. And similarly in the South Atlantic. Over that North Atlantic track region that I was just highlighting, to the west of the British Isles, there is what's called the upper airspace track structure. But essentially, airliners that are flying between, say, London and New York, or New York and London, or any part of Europe, basically, and North America,